So here's the thing that many countries are asking themselves. How do you trade with China without becoming dangerously dependent on it? America may control the global financial system, but China now controls global manufacturing. So in this video, I want to talk about the lessons that various countries have learned from their dealings with China. Hi, I'm Jasper Becker, and I've been writing about China for 40 years. So there are plenty of countries which have been punished by China in recent years, and we'll look at how they have dealt with this. Japan was hit by rare earth restrictions. South Korea was punished over missile defense. Australia targeted over political disputes. Lithuania pressured over Taiwan. And Taiwan itself squeezed economically. Germany is now worrying that it's become too deeply dependent on Chinese industry. And of course, we have the United States trying to shake loose from its reliance on China. So China is not unique in using economic coercion. The United States has used sanctions and financial pressure for decades, and Russia has weaponized its gas exports. And there are other examples. But China is different because it now sits at the center of the world's manufacturing system. And that was something that was never supposed to happen. Western governments always banked on the belief that trade would create peace. China would change if it became richer through globalization. China would liberalize its political system. And when it became more dependent on global stability for its prosperity, it would start behaving more like a normal country. This belief is based on what had happened to countries after the Second World War, like Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, Hong Kong, Germany, and others. But the Chinese Communist Party has had other ideas. It doesn't accept the Western idea that trade should not be used as a blunt instrument of diplomacy. China has always thought that way going back to the Qing dynasty, and more recently in the 1920s and 30s, Chinese nationalists organized anti-Japanese boycotts. Students and merchants said buying foreign goods weakened China, and that idea has never really gone away. So how should countries respond? Let's look at Japan and see what it learned. Back in 2010, during the dispute over the Senkaku Islands, China restricted rare earth exports to Japan. That shocked Tokyo. China realized dependence creates vulnerability, but Japan did not panic. Instead, it quietly diversified suppliers, invested in Australia, built stockpiles, subsidized supply chain relocation, and strengthens its alliances and increased defense spending. Japan's strategy today is even more sophisticated. It's not decoupled from China, nor is it surrendered to China. Instead, Japan says trade with China, but never again become critically dependent. That may be the most successful long strategy we've seen. South Korea has had a more bumpy experience. Korea tried to balance its US security ties with Chinese trade, but after deploying the THAAD missile defense system, China retaliated with tourism bans, pressure on Korean retailers, consumer boycotts, and restrictions on South Korea's entertainment exports. Korea realized something very important. Economic integration with China does not prevent political coercion. Since then, South Korea has slowly shifted towards more semiconductor cooperation with the US, supply chain diversification, and closer ties with Japan. But Korea still remains heavily dependent on China economically, and that makes Seoul much more cautious than Tokyo. And then there's the case of Australia. This is perhaps the most important case of all. Australia angered Beijing by banning Huawei and demanding investigation into the origins of COVID-19 and tightening foreign interference laws. China responded with tariffs and restrictions on Australian exports of wine, barley, coal, lobsters, and so on. At first, people thought Australia would fold, but instead, something unexpected happened. Australia survived far better than China expected. Exports diversified, iron ore remained indispensable to China, and at home, Australian resistance hardened. That lesson was noticed all around the world because it suggested economic coercion can backfire. Instead of creating submission, it can accelerate de risking, increase nationalism and alliance building, and industrial diversification. And then we have Europe. Europe is deeply divided. Germany became heavily dependent on the Chinese market, especially for automobiles and machinery. German elites believed for years that change through trade, Wandel durch Handel, would gradually moderate China. But Russia's invasion of Ukraine changed European thinking dramatically. Germany suddenly realized dependence can become very dangerous. And then there's the Russian gas problem. Now, Chinese manufacturing is the big issue. So Europe increasingly talks about de risking, not decoupling. France takes yet another approach. President Macron argues Europe should avoid becoming a vassal of either Washington or Beijing. France argues in favor of strategic autonomy, a European industrial policy, and some independent leverage. Meanwhile, in Eastern Europe, countries like Lithuania have become much more hawkish after experiencing direct Chinese pressure over its Taiwan ties. So Europe now contains several competing models simultaneously. And finally, we come to the United States. America has moved furthest towards confrontation. The US increasingly sees China not merely as a trading rival, but as a systemic competitor. So this is no longer simply about cheap imports. It's about controlling these industries, semiconductors, artificial intelligence, batteries, military hardware, and the very nature of industrial leadership. The United States has responded with tariffs, export controls, investment, restrictions, semiconductor bans, industrial subsidies, and friendshoring, that is, efforts to move supply chains to Mexico and other allied countries. What's fascinating about this is that the United States has discovered that tariffs alone won't solve the problem. China often redirects exports through East Asian countries, third countries, and creates indirect supply chains. So the struggle is evolving into something much larger, a contest over the structure of the global industrial system itself. Now, here's the deeper lesson from all these cases. China's economic coercion is usually selective, targeted, and deniable. China rarely wants a total rupture. Instead, it exerts pressure on politically symbolic sectors like tourism, agriculture, consumer goods, or individual companies. Why? Because China also depends on global markets, and Beijing usually tries to minimize damage to its own manufacturing system. And that's something that's very important to understand. So, what are the lessons that countries should learn? I think there are six major lessons. First, dependence matters more than trade volume. A country can trade heavily with China in safety, provided it has alternatives. Second, diversification must happen before the crisis starts. Once coercion begins, it's too late. Third, collective resistance is better than individual fights. China can pressure Lithuania more easily than it can the entire European Union. Fourth, industrial policy is coming back. Governments increasingly see semiconductors, batteries, and critical minerals as strategic assets. Fifth, total decoupling is unrealistic. China is now too large and too integrated into the global manufacturing system. And finally, economic interdependence does not eliminate geopolitical rivalry. In fact, it can intensify it, and that may be the biggest intellectual shift of all. For 30 years, globalization was supposed to reduce conflict. Instead, countries increasingly discovered that supply chains, finance, technology, manufacturing dependence can all too easily become instruments of power. So we are moving from an era of optimistic globalization into an era of strategic globalization. Trade will continue, but trust is shrinking, and that may define the next 20 years of the world economy. If you enjoyed this analysis, please subscribe, like the video, and let me know in the comments which country you think has handled China most successfully: Japan, Australia, America, or someone else entirely.